Hello, everyone. How are we all? I hope that you are having a fantastic day so far whenever you are getting around to watching or listening to this week's episode. Welcome back to the Natural Female Muscle Podcast. Today, you are joining me for episode number 51, where the topic of discussion today is going to be how we set up a productive off season. I feel as though it is obviously the time to talk about these things, whether that be coming off the back of a prep, coming off the back of a contest season, or ultimately looking at maybe your competition seasons up ahead. I find that this time of year is when obviously we have a lot of athletes transitioning into the off-season phase, but we also have a lot of potentially like new athletes or people who are considering, getting on stage in the future, reaching out to coaches saying like, hey, this is, where I want to compete. Like I want to start making some good progress and getting the off-season started from there. But of course, there's a lot of things that actually go into setting up a productive off season. Like I've spoken probably countless times before, and there's a lot of episodes where I go into like specifics of off season and, making the most of your ability to grow your training, whatever it is. But we haven't discussed really like the start point for that in terms of what is potentially necessary to get that off season going, get that growing phase actually off to a productive start and ultimately maintaining that as well. And that's obviously kind of where I'm at now, where I'm at the start of this off season for myself. So I did feel as though it was very fitting to get into that one. So I'm going to run through a couple of things today that I feel as though are important to stress, and I'm going to try and make this one a little bit more effective for you guys to listen to, because I'm aware that I do have a terrible habit of rambling on. Anyone who even watches my YouTube videos will be aware of this, and Joe, my videographer, has told me yesterday that I need to stop rambling and make things more efficient, but that is why I have a podcast, because it's long form, and I know that there'll probably be a little bit of a click off rate. You might have exited already by this point, but like these things need to be talked about in actual detail, and I never want to just skim over them. I'm just terrible at short form content. I can't do it because I want to dive into things too much. I want to cover everything. I know that sometimes I can't cover everything all at once, but I do want to make sure that I can dive into things into relatively decent detail. Anyway, I'm doing it again. So what are we going to talk about today? As I say, we're talking about setting up these productive off seasons, but let's just go through like what we're actually looking for and why do we need these phases to be productive. So we know that off seasons, and especially a longer one, can be, years and years in length, but either which way, even that long off season is always broken down into, multiple extended periods of gaining. Like if you're taking a 3-4 year off season, you're not spending 3-4 years growing. You're spending 3 to 4 years of trying to accumulate as many productive phases of gaining as possible. So that might look like 3, 4, 5 phases of gaining, and maybe, 2 or 3 or 4 phases of like very short pullbacks. And it's really important that when you go into the start of any of those gaining phases, you are in a responsive place in order to actually be, responsive and ready to grow with regards to where your variables are at and where your body composition is at. And you also want to make sure that you can then drive longevity in that gaining phase ahead. So you don't really want to be looking at a gaining phase that is literally going to be like 6 to 10 weeks. Like that, it's just not enough. It's just not really enough for you to actually gain any momentum. You're basically starting a phase of growing, and then you're basically stopping straight away as soon as things actually get rolling. So we're wanting to set up, at least with these gaining phases, like a good extended period of growing. And generally we're kind of looking at least that 16 to 20 week spot for most people. The difference to that is going to be when, somebody's maybe coming out of competition prep, and sometimes that specific gaining phase can be like 30 to 40 weeks, honestly, when it's well managed. Because if you think about somebody gaining, 20, 30 pounds, which they might do in that one stint of growth, if they manage that well, that could be very well be, like 40 weeks. And that's what you sometimes see happen, especially if somebody does like maybe a back-to-back prep. Like, for example, my client Beth, who is competing next year. She last competed in 2023. She came out of that prep and she spent literally like 40 weeks just in a surplus. Just very, very, very gradual rate of gain. Then we did pre-prep. Now we're coming back out and then we'll prep again next year. So that's where sometimes those phases are a little bit longer. But if you're talking about somebody who's not in, stage lean competition, you do really want to be at least a good, 4, 5, 6 months in those phases. And why do we want to spend a good amount of time in those phases? Well, the main thing is that we obviously want to spend as much time in a position where we can grow. We actually want to be in a position where we can spend extended periods of time with a surplus available. Like, that's important. We don't want to be like, we've got a surplus, we're going, okay, we pull back again. Like, we want to actually rinse the time that we can have in a surplus. We want to rinse the time that we can have then as a result of that away from a deficit for a number of reasons. So we have, the hormonal benefits of actually spending time at homeostasis and above, you're not actually in necessarily the best place from a stress standpoint when you are in a deficit constantly. This is what you see is when people do very, very, very short gaining phases, is like they're gaining, then they're pulling back, then they're gaining, then they're pulling back. And not only do they not put themselves in a position to basically not make any progress or make limited progress, but they also then are hormonally not necessarily in the best position where they're not recovering from a lot of these diet phases that they've been through. So every time they diet, less responsive and less responsive, and they're potentially accumulating other issues along the way, whether that be, gut issues, it could be thyroid issues, it could be issues with menstrual cycle irregularity. So going through these very like up and down phases all the time, rather than actually letting your body settle in a state away from a deficit, and actually spending some time away from that is really important. Obviously, the main thing with that as well is we want to spend more time, as I've just already touched on, gaining momentum, and actually spending more time at body weights where you can leverage greater performance. So that's kind of why we want these phases to be a bit longer as well, is so that you're not just like suddenly chucking on a load of body weight, then pulling it back off, and you've not actually been able to adapt to those body weights. You've not actually been able to spend more time being heavier, and as I say, adapting to being there, but then also rinsing the performance that you get through being at those body weights. That's really, really important. And this, as a natural athlete, I ramble on about it all the time, but I will never stop, just hammering this message, is that your body weight is your leverage for greater performance as a natural athlete. Obviously it has to be managed well, but this is everything that really enables you to grow. You manage your variables outside of it, yes, but like what you do in the gym is going to cause that growth, that progress. So you need to make sure that you're actually putting yourself in a position where you can see body weight increase. You have the surplus available so that you can grow, but you're also spending time at those body weights where you can drive up performance to places that it's never been before. And for most females as well, that is even more so significant because a lot of us are very, very light by nature. So if we're spending a lot of time, like say, for example, you're doing these very, very short gaining phases. This was me at the start of my bodybuilding journey, and I'll tell you this straight up. So I started, like, my body weight was probably like 47 kilos, and I pretty much lived between 46, 47 kilos and 52 kilos, I think was the heaviest that I ever got. And my gaining phases were very short. So like 10, 12 weeks, like 10, 12 weeks gaining. Okay, pull back, 6-week diet. And then it was the same thing over and over again. Like I never spent long enough actually in those phases through, not setting them up well, not managing them well, and not having these good kind of like start points for these off seasons. And as a result, then I never really changed. I just looked the same every time I pushed up for a little bit, then I pulled back. And all I was basically doing was adding body fat and then pulling back the body fat rather than actually spending time in positions where I could actually gain muscle mass. Whereas comparatively now, I sit generally a little bit heavier in my off season. Like 52 kilos for me now is not that far off my stage weight. I'm not far off 52 kilos at the moment, so it's like those are things you have to manage. That's one reason, as I say, why I want to spend time away from a deficit. Another thing is that, like, honestly, there's obviously just life benefits to not dieting. So as much as there's hormonal benefits, there's the benefits of, when we look at progress, we want to make sure that we're not spending a lot of time dieting, but like just in life, like you don't want to be dieting all the time, in my opinion. I think that even if you enjoy dieting, like I love dieting, like I do enjoy it. I feel good when I diet. I like having that goal. Of course I do. But when it comes to actual life, like it's limiting, because I can't just, well, you can, but it is interruptive when it comes to just switching off and being able to do things with family and having more freedom and having more food and being able to travel or being able to go to events. Like, I think it's good for you, especially as a bodybuilder, to not be in this constant cycle of like fat loss, a little bit of growth, fat loss, fat loss. You want to make sure that you can actually set yourself up for a good bit of time to actually productively grow, gain some good momentum, get your body in a natural good space. So essentially, this is why setting up a good productive off season from the get-go is very important, and creating a good start point, because you want to make sure that you're in a position where you can have that extended phase of gaining and you have a good bit of time ahead of you before you essentially hit the wall. When people like hit the wall in the gaining phase, where either body comp gets too messy, or variables are no longer being managed well, or training performance is no longer driving up, you're just not getting the benefits of being there. We want to try and make sure that with where we're starting, we have got a good run ahead of us. Like I say, that 4 to 6 to 7 months of growing, so that we can extract the most out of that. So this might be then where you, like, say, inquire with a coach. Like, I get this a lot, like this kind of time of year, where people are saying, I want to compete maybe end of 2025 or 26. Like, I want to now, get the off season going. I want to make some progress. Like, let's go. And we go, right, okay, what's the start point? Where do we go from here? How do we map out the timeline? And a lot of the time you might think, okay, like, we just want to go into off season. We're just going to, head into a surplus. But that's actually not always the best thing to do, because the first thing we need to do is address that start point. Like, we need to assess, are we actually in a good place body composition wise to go into an extended gaining phase? Like, you need to make sure that you are not starting your growing phase too soft. I think a lot of people do that. I think, I'm ready to grow. Like, let's get bulking. And it's like, no, like, are we in actually a good productive spot for us to head into an extended phase of growing and actually getting some good little bit of body fat on, but of course muscle mass as well? Or are we going to get to a point in literally like 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks where we need to pull back? Like, we just don't have a runway. Basically, we don't have a runway. And this is where often, like, we maybe just need to create a runway. And you actually start before you go into your off season, or before you go into your gaining phase, by doing a diet phase first. And I often will do this with a lot of clients when they do come to me. Obviously, it always depends what position they are in. But sometimes if somebody's just coming in and saying, right, we want to get a good gaining phase ahead, I want to make progress, we maybe just need to actually tidy up body composition a little bit first. And this actually has benefits for a number of different reasons. So like I say, firstly, it gives you that room in terms of body composition for us to actually be able to push things for an extended period of time. Because if you think about running a 16 to 20 week gaining phase, you're talking 8, 10, 12 pounds. You might not have that ahead of you to push. If you were to push from there, you're going to basically already get to that point where it's not just about how things look, because you might be pretty comfortable in where you're at that point. It's the fact that you then start to accumulate a lot more body fat relative to muscle mass. You're maybe not even going to get necessarily the benefits of that from a performance standpoint, because you might even start to notice other markers drop off, like your fitness levels start to drop off. You're noticing problems now with insulin resistance, blood glucose management. Your appetite is absolutely shot. Your sleep quality actually starts to drop off a little bit more. All of these things that are just basically you experiencing negative returns already. It's like, we want to not really be in that position. So that's like one thing that we can obviously counter by making sure that we run that fat loss phase first, is just getting you in a position where we're not going to run into that position, hopefully. But it's also really good to set up a really good base with your variables as well. So especially if you are maybe new to starting coaching, this can be really helpful. Or even if, let's be honest, you've been in a spot where you haven't been knuckling down on some things, you've been maybe in like not a diet phase, not a prep, not anything like that for a good period of time. And maybe some things in your routine are just getting a little bit flexible or a little bit lax. Heading into a diet phase to begin with can really help you to just tidy up those things or make improvements to them, because you kind of, one, you have to, and two, you're a little bit more motivated to do that as well when you know you have this fat loss goal in place. So you might benefit from having anywhere from like 4 to 8 to 10 weeks, depends on where you're at, of just having a nice, good, tidy up phase, getting body composition in a good spot, really improving all of your variables. So like we make sure that your routine is in a good spot, your appetite management is in a good spot, your management of your day-to-day is good, your sleep is good, your training is in a really good spot as well. This is also really helpful, is that we build this base of training too, because you're not just like instantly trying to progress your training. You're kind of aware that, right, we're just maybe maintaining performance as we pull body fat down, and we actually set a really good baseline of execution before we then head into a surplus and we start to improve things from there. So that's a really, really good benefit from this. So essentially, make sure your start point is in a good spot. I've already discussed in the past episode about if you're coming from a prep scenario, how we want to make sure that we do manage that post-show phase so that we do have a good start point. That's really important. So if you are coming from a prep side of things, have a good listen to that episode because that runs through things in good detail. But if you're coming from like a non-prep side of things, just in general life, wanting to set up a gaining phase, make sure that you have got a good runway ahead of you. If you're inquiring with a coach, they will have a good idea from just looking at you and speaking to you as to whether, you're in a position to head into a growing phase or not, or if you need to do a little bit of a tidy up from there. I even sometimes will run like just maintenance phases just for like a good 4 weeks whilst we get somebody adapted to, their habits with nutrition, their habits with training, and their habits with their routine, just setting a good base before we start to put a surplus in, because it just makes sure that we have that base from there. If they're not actually in need of getting any leaner, sometimes that's where we just kind of make sure we run that kind of like holding phase and setting phase really to go from. So following on from that start point, and this leads in really nicely to my second point with the variable management, which is make sure that straight from the get-go, like you aren't being lazy with your routine. Like have a good routine in place, and uphold this and uphold your accountability with this as well as you continue throughout this phase, because this is going to really, really help with longevity as well. So make sure that, from the start, just because you're in a gaining phase, it doesn't mean that you really change anything. Like the only thing that changes from you being in a fat loss phase to being in a growing phase, and don't get me wrong, I know it can be hard as you get heavier to manage these variables well, but the only thing that does change is literally the energy input. So it's like you go from being in a deficit, so eating less, moving a bit more, to now eating more and moving less. And that, like in itself, can be difficult with routine management, because maybe you get to a point where, your appetite is a little bit lower, or you're feeling a little bit more lethargic, blah, blah, blah. But the problem is that when you don't keep your routine, these things are worse, like the side effects are worse. So if you don't have a routine, you will feel more lethargic. If you don't have a routine, your appetite will be short, your digestion will be short. You will feel very sluggish because you're not keeping your body in a good space. So uphold your routine, not uphold your variables. So like keep your daily step routine. Yes, your output is going to be lower, but still move your body where you can do. The setup of this is going to vary massively based on like your job and what works well, but you and your coach will have some form of output because you still need to move your body. You still need to move your body in a growing phase, and it's actually really, really important for you to keep moving your body so you can keep blood glucose well monitored, so you can actually be insulin sensitive, so that you can actually manage your digestion, so that you can also keep your headspace in a good spot. All these things that are really key. You're just not pushing your output to the point where it's driving up fatigue massively, or it's creating stress. And based on, your lifestyle, maybe you work in an office, maybe instead your steps are a bit lower and we do cardio and we stay on top of that. Like these are things that you do need to absolutely stay on top of and set in place from the get-go. So make sure that you do keep your step routine, your activity routine in place. As I said, stay on top of your cardio if that's in place. Don't let yourself get super slack with that. Stay on top of being hydrated. Make sure that you continue to keep a good sleep routine. Make sure that you continue to put effort into your meals. Don't just suddenly drop off on all of these things, because I have been there. I have been there where I have gotten a little bit lazier with my variables. Like my steps have gotten to like 5,000-6,000 a day. Like I think probably 2021, early 2021. So like that first sort of off season. I mean, to be fair, my off season that I ran in 2019 to 2020 was woeful, like so bad. When I was at uni, I had no routine. I had no routine at all. It's probably the best example is like I was still doing my cardio and I was getting all my meals in. I was training hard, but like I had no sleep routine. I had no day-to-day routine, like all those things. And my appetite was god awful. But similarly in 2021, I think even after my first prep, that was my first off season, like I still did everything I needed to do to say, but I started to get lazy with my meals in the sense that I put no effort into them. Like, so I didn't enjoy them. So my appetite was rubbish and I probably wasn't like walking anywhere near as much as I should have done. Yeah, the weather sucked. I probably should have gone out in the cold. Now I have a walking pad to make sure that even when the weather's awful, I still get my movement in. Like there were just things that I wasn't probably staying on top of that were then causing me to go on that downward trend. And it's like stay on top of these things. And the best stint of off season that I probably had was at the end of my last off season. All throughout that end of 2023, start of 2024, I was the heaviest that I'd been. I'd been in an off season 4 years, but all my variables were the best that they'd ever been as well. You know, my sleep was still great. My appetite was still great, and purely because like I kept on top of these things that are so easy to lose. You know, like I made sure that I still was strict with when I needed to go to bed. I made sure that I still put effort into my meals, and I actually found that one of the best things as well was like keeping good quality food in like from the start and rinsing this as long as you can do. Like try not to let yourself suddenly go towards poorer quality food sources, more processed foods, very, very low volume food sources, like eating a lot of things like granola or having a lot of like sugary things like muffins or squares bars or things that just honestly make your digestion feel awful, and then also make your appetite feel rubbish as well. And then they're also causing issues in blood glucose spikes, and then that's just making you feel terrible and lethargic all day. So it's like stay on top of a lot of these things that really, really, really do help to keep you in this off season, keeping your variables in your good spot for the longest period possible. Uphold those from the start and rinse them as long as they can. So that's all about creating longevity. And the next point, which kind of falls on part of this, and again, I know I kind of mentioned this in the last video, is make sure you do manage your off-plan meals well straight from the start. Even if, you know, you're in those leaner body compositions to begin with, you might think, oh, I can afford maybe a bigger off-plan meal or whatever it is. Like you want to make sure that you can actually increase your baseline day-to-day of food. You know, like that is really, really important because we don't want the off-plan meals to be pulling away from your ability to drive up that day-to-day increase, which is going to potentially cause issues with that cycle of like low food during the majority of the week and then high food for off-plan meals, which is not going to actually lead you to be in a good place with your relationship with food, be in a good place with your hunger signaling, be in a good place with fueling your performance regularly on the day-to-day. So there's issues there. There's also the issues with the fact that if you are having these massive off-plan meals, you're also really negatively influencing your rate of gain, and you're potentially going to be gaining at a much faster rate, but you're still at a point where then your baseline food is actually really low. And then that also affects your body composition, that also affects your energy levels. And you're going to find that that diet is going to creep up pretty fast. And that's probably the worst position that most people do find themselves in when it comes to limiting their potential to have a good long phase of growing, is that they get 6 weeks in and they're maybe now 6-7 pounds up, but all of that 6-7 pounds has come from them gaining a pound every week from an off-plan meal, and they've not actually put themselves in a position where their food is any higher, and they've not put themselves in a position where they actually really look any better or fueled any better performance, because they've just been basically gaining a pound every week and taking on all of their surplus just from this one off-plan meal on this one day on this during the week. And that's not really a position that you want to be in. And just making sure that you can absolutely still have off-plan meals, but it's just about managing them well within your goals at that point in time. And also understanding that ultimately, if you get further into that gaining phase and your baseline food is much higher, you're going to have a bit more freedom to have these off-plan meals. Your hunger signaling is going to be in a place where you can understand and control it a bit better to manage those off-plan meals better anyway, just naturally. So it's making sure that you do kind of have awareness of that from the get-go, and if there are any issues, just addressing them and kind of nipping them in the bud straight away, and not letting it be something that gets out of hand to the point where then we're like, right, we've got to pull back, and we obviously don't want to be in a position where we have to do that when we've not actually gained any good momentum or really productive weeks within within those gaining phases as well, or been able to get variables in a great spot either. So make sure that you manage your off-plan meals. So those are a couple of things with routine nutrition. Obviously, a very important part of setting up a good off season comes down to the training, and we want to make sure that training is in a productive, progressive spot. And a really important part of that at the very start of that gaining phase is making sure that you aren't starting with really, really high fatigue, and you also aren't driving fatigue up massively straight out of the gates. So the first thing of not starting with super high fatigue is making sure that whenever you get going with, your training block to grow, you may be probably thinking, oh, we're just going to go in full volume, off we go. When did you last actually take any form of deload or devolume or rest? Or when did you last back off? Are you actually starting at a point where you're already pretty smashed? And the two, I suppose, like main issues that I see here are like, one, when people come off the back of prep, not taking enough rest that their body needs, especially if they've been pushing a lot at the end of prep, because a lot of people sometimes are in a spot where they've been backing off a lot at the end of prep. Like for me, for example, at the end of this past prep, I'd been basically doing what were like very low intensity sessions for a long period of time, like some obviously hard sending sessions, but like 6, 7, 8 weeks, I'd been pretty much backing off. I'd also not had really high fatigue from cardio or output or anything like that for the last 6 or 7 weeks of prep. So I was not really in that high of a fatigue spot comparative to, say somebody who has been pushing into that final show. They've been doing 45 minutes on the stairs. They've been full sending their training. They've not had a devolume. They've just been pushing training. They maybe backed off training a bit in that peak week, but that's it. They're probably going to need to take a good few days off, and it depends on that person, depends on their stress response, etc. But you don't want to be in that position where you are then going from there to literally just starting new training, like, right, off season, time to improve, let's go. And you've had no time to take your foot off the gas. And the other position as well is just somebody who is maybe not coming from a prep standpoint, but just is maybe carrying a lot of fatigue and doesn't realize, because a lot of people do not necessarily know to back off. And if you've maybe just been training your own, maybe you've been training 5, 6, 7 times a week, I see it a lot, and there's been literally no form of backing off. Now, not everyone needs it. If you actually are good and you're actually fine, amazing. But a lot of people live in that kind of state of just like fight or flight constantly and don't realize that they're there, especially if they have very demanding lifestyle, family life, jobs, etc. And the main thing we want to make sure is that we are starting this training block with a good like 8 to 12 weeks of like nice progressions ahead. We're not going to hit a massive fatigue wall in like 2, 3, 4 weeks. We're going to have to pull back. Like we want to gain some good momentum. So make sure that you're actually starting in a fresh spot. So this is where often, like at the start of this phase, like before you head into this off season, make sure that you've taken either days off or some time to do some deloads, devols. It's where if a client first starts with me before we go into a phase like this, we'll probably run like that first rotation at devolume, because that allows us to drop off that fatigue, but it also means that they can start a new training split as well without a huge amount of stress. Like they're getting used to new movements. There's maybe a lot of like novel stimulus from different movements within that. If you're starting a new training split, you can get your body adapted to that first, and then we can start to drive up the volume, and then we can start to drive up the intensity. So make sure that you have that base there. And of course, alongside that is making sure that you're not then driving up the fatigue straight out of the gates with the actual training setup in and of itself. So when you are programming and when you are maybe even giving crushing suggestions to your coach, you're programming your own sessions, you don't want to necessarily throw the kitchen sink at it when it comes to your training for a gaining phase. And I know it's very, very tempting where you're thinking like, right, I want to improve this. We're going into a growing phase right now, especially off the back of a prep. But even regardless of that, even if you're just coming off the back of a diet or you're just starting up with a new training split, you can't do everything at once, because unless you have the most resilient body on earth, if you look at that training phase and you think, right, now we're going to ramp up volume, we're also going to address all of these weak parts. We're going to add in more volume for this. We're going to start doing loads of lower back loading. We're going to start doing all this stuff that we've not been doing before. Your body's going to be like, whoa, like we are feeling pretty smashed from doing all of this new stuff. You have to gradually taper yourself up to that. You can't do everything all at once. And that is probably one of the biggest mistakes that people do make when it comes to training is you're so eager to progress. You're so eager to work on all these things that you want to improve that you then actually limit yourself from making those improvements because your body is not in a position to recover from it. You can only benefit from as much as you can actually recover from. If you're not recovering from your training, you're not getting the benefit from it. You're just not, point blank, so you need to make sure that you can recover from what you're doing. So as much as it's tempting to look at your training phase when you come maybe out of a prep or you're going into a growing phase and you think, I want a barbell row and I want a deadlift and I want a barbell back squat and I want a barbell bench, which are usually like the main requests. You have to go, right, okay, are we in a position where our body is going to be ready to do that? Maybe not. Maybe at some point in the future we can add these things in, but right now we just need to gradually move it up. You would much rather be a little bit more on the cautious side and be able to build things up rather than push things way too hard and then you're injured or you're not recovered, you're having to take another deload again in like 4-6 weeks. Like, just be a bit more cautious to begin with. And then if recovery is good, you can start to drive things up from there. So that's the most important thing when it comes to a training standpoint and making sure that you've set training up to have a good productive phase of growing. So the final thing that I actually want to go through is just a very, very quick mention to say that, to make sure that you have a good and long productive growing phase ahead of you, there is obviously the mental side of things as well, where you need to make sure that you are excited and aware of, I suppose, the changes that are going to come to your body as you are going to experience body weight gain. Like, if you're going into a growing phase, your body fat is going to increase. You are also going to increase muscle mass. So do not forget that. You will increase muscle mass, and a body that is gaining body fat and body weight is not necessarily a worse body. It's not. But that's something that you need to be able to wrap your head around, in the sense that you can look forward to the phase. You don't resist the phase. I think that this can go in a couple of different ways, where you almost try to avoid the body weight gain and you're maybe overexpending, or you're maybe honestly not even eating all your meals, or you're trying to kind of see it as a win if your body weight doesn't go up, or you're almost thinking like, right, I need to diet now because I'm a little bit softer. Like, you need to be able to embrace this phase of growing and understand, like, right, body weight is going to go up at a nice gradual pace, and that is okay, and that is good. I think that preparing yourself for that is important, and setting in stone self-care for yourself and for your body at the very, very start of that phase and upholding that is key. These are, again, like the best things that you can do for yourself when you go into a growing phase. And it's, as I touched on, that kind of like last phase of this off season for me was the best I'd felt. And a big part of that as well was the fact that I actually started to look after myself. And I'm not just talking about looking after myself with managing my bodybuilding stuff. I'm talking about stuff outside of that, like actually putting effort into my hair and my makeup and the things that I wear, and looking after, like, basically feeling good in the body that I had and the growing body that I was in, and not kind of just like, honestly, like letting myself go and not taking care of myself, because that's also less to do with actually like how you look and liking it. And it's more so the act of self-care. It's the act of looking after yourself. It's the act of doing these things for yourself that do make you have a positive association with that phase and with your body and yourself at that point in time, that I think are really important. So make sure that you start acting on that at the beginning. You don't resist it. You don't keep trying to like fit into clothes that you wore when you were leaner. You don't keep trying to do these things. You just pay attention to where you're at that point in time and take care of yourself. Because if you just make sure that you start this from the get-go, it's going to give you a really, really good phase to just build on that moving forward. So those are really just like, I think there are 5 things that I went through today. I'm going to make sure I leave it there, because I need to keep these relatively short and snappy, and that's long enough. So hopefully those are 5 things that you can take on board into the start of your off season, and make sure that you're kind of carrying those with you into the off season ahead. If you create a good starting point, begin the off season as you mean to go on, You will have a really, really good gaining phase ahead of you. Like, these are times for flexibility, 100%, but also, upholding accountability with yourself is important, mainly just to make these phases enjoyable. Because like I say, you don't really want to be in a position where you're having to pull yourself back, really soon, and maybe limiting the time that you can enjoy spending there, and obviously the time that you could be making progress. I think it's important for me to note at the very end that there is a little bit of a caveat to this. So whilst I mentioned at the start that sometimes you'll want to do a fat loss phase and you might get to a point you've got a diet back, not everyone is in a position where they should start off with a diet or where they can start off with a diet. So say, for example, you're in a position, and I'm going to give two examples of this actually, because it's the best way for me to run through it. Say somebody comes to me and they are wanting to start a phase of growing, and I look at their body composition and I think, right, we're not really in a position where we can, push body weight more from here. But they're also feeding back to me that hormonally they're not in a great spot, or their food isn't in a good spot. So like, I'm already looking at them and they're doing a lot of expenditure and their food is quite low, and maybe they've not had a regular menstrual cycle, etc. I'm going, right, okay, well, we're not in a position to necessarily go into a gaining phase, but we're also not in a position where I want to diet you or where your body's going to be responsive. So we just need to hold. We need to build you up to a good place at maintenance, drop off fatigue, drop off any stresses, and actually hormonally restore a lot of things that are not in a great place at the moment. So that's where sometimes we'll do that. Another example is also the very common post-show example, where somebody has maybe not been able to manage their post-show as they would like, or they've had a really difficult time post-show, and already maybe they're not too far into that off-season and they're basically at the peak body weight of their previous off-season. They're already at their projected end point for that gaining phase. And that can happen, you come out of a prep and you've maybe got planned, say your stage weight was 100 pounds and you're thinking, right, at the end of this first gaining phase will be 130 pounds. And unfortunately, for 6 weeks, you're already about there, and that happens, it does happen. Some people have a really difficult time, and that's okay. And we learn from that. But that's where you definitely do not want to be dieting. You definitely do not want to be dieting from there, because hormonally, you're not going to be in a happy spot. Your body is not going to respond well and it's not going to feel good. You need to just spend some time, getting your body to homeostasis. And sometimes that's actually where you have to accept that your body's maybe going to get a little bit softer than that. And you might be in a very, very, very minor surplus. But these are all things that are important for your body to spend time away from a deficit to, as I say, regain your regular menstrual cycle, to make sure that your thyroid health is in a good spot, to make sure that you're mentally in a good place as well. These are all things that are necessary. So sometimes you might not always have a perfect start point for a gaining phase, and that's okay. And that's where spending maybe a little bit of time just holding at maintenance, or being in a very, very, very gradual surplus and just getting your body back to homeostasis is the most important thing. And yes, those periods may be not quote unquote optimal for growth, but they are optimal for your longevity. They are optimal for your health. And that is a key part of your bodybuilding process, so don't always just think so short term. It's about the bigger picture. Okay. So don't worry yourself if you're not in this position at the start. I probably should have put this at the start of the episode so that people could listen to it. But if you've made it to the end and you're worrying, you're thinking, oh, maybe some of these things aren't right, don't worry about it, because there are still other things that you can do to get your body back into a good spot. Things don't always have to be perfect. You live and you learn from different phases that you go through. And I say this time and time again, as much as I talk about being in a great spot myself, I have been doing this for a good period of time now. I'm not far off doing this for a decade, so I've lived and learned from a lot of different phases myself. And you do just learn and develop more and more the more that you do these things. So hopefully this has been a helpful episode for you guys. Please, if anyone has any requests, I've had a few requests, but if you've got any more requests of things that you want me to do in terms of future episodes, whether that be guests, whether that be topic discussions, anything like that, you let me know. This podcast is for you. You know, it's not about me. It's about what I can give for you guys. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. If you have enjoyed this, please share it, because I love to see that these episodes are helpful. I've had a few incredible messages as of lately that have just been unreal for me to read, in terms of the way that, you know, these episodes have helped people, even if it's just been, you know, listening to me yapping on in your ear whilst you're getting your steps done, your jobs done. You know, to have any impact is incredible. So thank you to all of you that listen. As I say, oh my God, I almost dropped the microphone on myself. Thank you for listening. Share it if you have enjoyed it. Make sure to follow, like, subscribe, all that amazing stuff. And I'll catch you all in the next one.